Adrian Lithgow, his father Jimmy, and editor Catherine Pienaar have been pouring their blood, sweat and tears into documenting the history of horse racing in South Africa. Lithgow's passion for horse racing stems from growing up in a horse-loving family.
And I went to the race course before, race courses were open to minors, and snuck in and watched horses like Flaming Rock, and there's nothing more exhilarating than watching a champion racehorse run. It's poetry in motion. It just takes your breath away, and it's all about really the passion of watching these animals, the champions. And I mean, why not record their stories? They're so fascinating. They're amazing athletes. They're the greatest athletes on earth, the thoroughbred racehorse. And I think not to record their stories and their history is just, it's a sin, really. They lay it all out on the race course to grow an industry, and kind of this industry has been forged on their backs, and not to remember them, what they did, would just be a shame.
Lithgow has read accounts of South African natives already riding horses when Van Riebeeck arrived in 1652, but the earliest written accounts of racing dates back about 140 years later to 1790.
It started around about 1790. The governor of the Cape at the time was a chap called Lord Charles Somerset, whose father in England was very interested in racing, and he shared the passion for racing. So he came out to South Africa and was hanging out at the Cape and on Greenpoint Common, and decided that there should be racing. Now, we're not talking about thoroughbreds in those times. We're talking about hardy little Cape horses, partbreds, anything that they could throw their leg over and ride in a race, and probably have a few pounds on or a few shillings on. That's what they were doing. And so those were the early days. And then obviously as time went on, it became more professional. In the time of around about the 1860s is where we really started getting, where racing really started getting more defined through the thoroughbred. More horses were imported. It got a lot more professional. A jockey club was set up, a stud book was set up, and so it was far more regulated. Well, it was all over South Africa. The nature of this country is that that 1860 settlers came in and they diversified, and they went out and went to the Karoo and went all over the place, landed in PE. And so there was racing all over the place, and then what happened was gold and diamonds, and that gave rise to new wealth. And where there's wealth, people want to have an outlet and be able to spend their money. So what they did was they got involved in racing.
As the hobby became more of a professional sport, the industry began taking off.
The start of the jockey club would have been a very significant moment, because that was pretty much the start of the professional era, I guess. When a stud book happened, it gave rise to the breeding industry in South Africa. That no longer were kind of part-bred horses eligible to run in races. It was the dawn of the professional era, really. And then, of course, when gold was discovered in Johannesburg, it was the start of the Johannesburg Handicap in 1887, and what would become the Summer Cup. And at the same time, racing in Natal, which started for a very different reason, in that the military was based in Natal and they wanted something to do, so they were, spending their time as well also racing, and that's how racing started there. So in the different eras or areas in South Africa, racing was birthed through various different reasons.
The breeding industry grew dramatically. More horses were being imported from Europe and other parts of the world. And back home, the Karoo offered the perfect conditions for breeding winners.
In the beginning years of breeding in South Africa, we're talking about when in kind of 1860 the Karoo was defined as a breeding region. When the settlers came in, they made a lot of money from wool farming, from sheep farming, and the Karoo was really the place that you wanted to be if you wanted to farm sheep. And what they noticed was that the Karoo was also very good for breeding horses. They weren't breeding in a professional capacity, but they were breeding horses for, for transport horses and that kind of thing. We're talking about the 1860s now. And what they noticed was that the Karoo grew horses very strong bone, very hardy horses. And so it gave rise to the Karoo as a breeding region, and really it's all to do with the minerals, the lime and the phosphorus in the ground, and the fact that the horses, because of the expansive open spaces, they can be ranched. It's a ranching system, so the horses are basically sent out and they're grown out in the veld, basically on the Karoo veld. They grow up very hardy, and South Africa produced many champions, hardy, tough, durable, strong, brilliant racehorses. At that time you had the Randlord era, and there were 3 or 4 guys who had plenty of money through their mining enterprises, and they set up vast studs. You're talking about Henry Norse, who had Dwarsvlei stud. He had 3 or 4 studs, but Dwarsvlei at that time was the biggest stud in the world, and possibly even today is one of the biggest. As an individual stud, would probably rate as one of the biggest ever in the history of thoroughbred breeding in the world on a global scale. So this country has a huge history of thoroughbred breeding, and basically what happened was the era of the Randlords kind of came to an end around about 1940 at the outbreak of the Second World War. As things changed after the Second World War, as more business grew in Cape Town and in Durban, venture capitalists pretty much wanted their horses to be closer to them, and the stallions started moving out of the Karoo, and when the stallions moved out, the mares started moving out, and they found that it was very difficult to travel mares with babies, with foals at foot, to get to the stallions and travel them back. It was risky, they were losing a lot of horses, a lot of babies, and it wasn't viable. And basically it comes down to money. When the money moved out of the Karoo with the end of the Randlord era, that's what kind of signaled the slow decline of the Karoo as a breeding region.
The evolution of horse racing can especially be seen in the nature of events and the people the sport attracts. What was once a purely aristocratic hobby has now become a social sport where even the average Joe can get involved.
After 1995, when London News won in Hong Kong, that could have been a turning point, because we were in isolation for so many years. And now we're kind of in an international era that, all our good horses pretty much after their 3-year-old careers in South Africa, when they're seen to be something special, they get on a plane and they leave and they go to foreign shores and they fly the flag overseas.
As for South Africa's legendary horses, Lithgow has an obsession with one specific horse from the 60s.
Sea Cottage was a horse trained by Sid Laird. He was a light-framed, effeminate horse. He was a very unique-looking horse. He had a big white face and 4 white legs. He was a light bay. He was a well-bred horse, but he didn't really have the constitution in the beginning of a racehorse. He was pretty much an ugly duckling who grew into this devastating racehorse. He had a devastating turn of foot. He would come from off of the pace no matter where you put him, and he would just mow down the opposition. He won with impossible weights from impossible positions on his back, and he was just brilliant as a 3-year-old, and he went into the 1966 July as the favourite. And things were very different in South Africa back then. Betting regulations were different. And he was shot basically by, there was a hit put out on him, and he was shot in the hind quarter by a guy called Johnny Nell while he was going to work one morning on the Blue Lagoon beach, because in those days they used to train on the beach, and a hired gunman for various reasons shot him in the hind quarter to put him out of the race. He still ran in the race. He was shot on the 15th of June, and 3 weeks later he ran in the July, having had very little work. With the bullet still lodged in his hind quarter, and he ran 5th. He was beaten by his stable companion Java Head, and he came back the following year to dead heat in the July with a horse called Jollify, who the turnaround, the weight difference was 13 kilograms between Jollify, what he was carrying, and Sea Cottage, what he was carrying. Jollify skipped clear, went to the front. Sea Cottage came from tailed off and had to make up one hell of a margin of ground. And he got up on the post to dead heat with Jollify, and in what many would believe would be the greatest kind of July finish in the history of the race.
If you'd like to know more about Adrian Lithgow's series, you can go to his Facebook page, Legends of the Turf.